Hi, I'm Mitch Resnick, Professor of Learning Research here at the MIT Media Lab, and I'd like to welcome you to the very first episode of my new podcast, Lifelong Kindergarten. I'm starting this podcast because I'm really worried about many things happening in the world these days, and I want to explore how different approaches to learning and education could help bend the world in a better direction. With this podcast series, I'm hoping to highlight ideas and examples for catalyzing meaningful change in how children imagine, create, play, share, and learn, and ultimately, meaningful change for society. In many ways, the podcast builds on the work of my lifelong kindergarten research group at the MIT Media Lab. For more than 30 years, our group has developed technologies, activities, and strategies for engaging children around the world in creative learning experiences. For example, we collaborated with the Lego Company on the development of Lego Mindstorms and other robotics kits for kids. And we developed Scratch and OctoStudio, software platforms that enable kids to create and share interactive stories, games, and animations. But more important than these technologies are the educational ideas underlying them. And that's what this podcast series will focus on. In everything that our research group has worked on over the past 3 decades, whether it's a new technology or a new online course or a new space for learning, we've been guided by a consistent, enduring set of educational goals and values. We've always focused on expanding opportunities for children from diverse communities to develop as creative, curious, caring, and collaborative learners. These 4 C's are timeless values. If I were alive 100 years ago, I hope I would have been advocating for the same goals for education and learning. But I feel these values are more important now than ever before. We live in a world where measurement, efficiency, and optimization are too often valued over human needs, interests, and experiences. And I worry that the situation is becoming even worse. There are 2 huge disruptions in the world today. There's a disruption caused by the proliferation of AI technologies and the disruption caused by the rise of authoritarian governments. There's a real risk that these disruptions could lead to a dehumanization of society so that people have less choice and less voice in their lives. Because of these disruptions, the 4C approach to education and learning is more needed than ever before and also more threatened than ever before. In each episode of this podcast series, I'll have a conversation with a researcher or educator to explore ideas and examples on how to nurture creative, curious, caring, and collaborative learners. I want to highlight people around the world who are doing exciting work in supporting 4C learning. And I hope that this podcast can serve as one way to build community among people who recognize the need for significant change in our approach to education and learning in order to move towards a more creative, empathetic, pluralistic, and democratic society. For this first episode of the podcast series, I invited my longtime collaborator, Natalie Rusk. I first met Natalie in the late 1980s when she was a graduate student at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I was a grad student in computer science here at MIT. We've been working together ever since. Natalie was the driving force behind our Computer Clubhouse project, a network of after-school learning centers for youth from marginalized communities. She played a central role in the design of our Scratch coding platform, and she's now leading the development of our OctoStudio mobile coding app. Along the way, Natalie also earned a PhD in child development at Tufts University. In all of our projects together over the years, Natalie has been a consistent and persuasive advocate for supporting children's interests, providing children with opportunities to work on personally meaningful projects that grow out of their interests and allow them to further develop their interests. That's been a guiding principle in all of our work and an essential element in our efforts to support children in their development as creative, curious, caring, and collaborative learners. So I think Natalie is the ideal person for kicking off this Lifelong Kindergarten podcast series. Thanks for joining us, Natalie, for this initial episode of the Lifelong Kindergarten podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
You know, we've worked together on lots of projects over the last 35 years. And I know one thing that you've always emphasized in all of our projects is the importance of young people developing their interests and following their interests and building on their interests. So maybe you could share a little bit about why you feel that that's so important.
Yeah, I think part of it comes from my childhood. I was always interested in school, but my younger brother was not. It didn't really connect with him. And so he just didn't connect with school. But then I would see when he went home, he was an avid learner, actually, and especially around his passion of music and sound. And I've seen just how throughout his life, he's built an incredible number of skills, and it all grows from his interest in music. So he ended up leaving high school early, but then starting to learn how to do electronic music and do electronics. And then he learned about computers and communication with other people around the world and engineering and building things and just so many different things. And it all comes from his love of sound and music. So I just realized, even though, some of us like me like school, for a lot of people that really, it was outside of school that he really learned a lot and really thrived as a learner. And so I always wondered, like when I decided to go study education, how could we build on interests that people have, young people's interests?
Yeah, I know you really brought that with, I know one of the first projects that we worked on together was the Computer Clubhouse project, where we, helped start this, after school center for young people from marginalized communities. How is it that your interest in interest factored into that?
Yeah, well, so in the early 90s, people were starting to talk about this gap of technological gap of who had computers and not. I saw an even bigger gap in after school time at the time between kids who had access to experiences to start pursuing their interests, whatever that was, sports, music, theater, all kinds of things that they could do, and other kids who didn't have access to those resources and opportunities. So I was, as we were brainstorming this after school program and space and seeing what kids, I was working in a museum, what they were interested in, thinking that we really needed to make a space that supported young people in developing their interests, both with what we had available and also having mentors available to help support that.
Yeah, I remember sometimes with those kids, some of their teachers from their schools would come in and see them there, and they were shocked because they saw these kids who were totally disinterested in school. They weren't paying attention.
Right.
They weren't getting anything. And then at the clubhouse, they were totally engaged.
Yeah.
So I think that they saw that once they were given the opportunity to follow their interest, it really changed their whole approach to.
Yeah, and you just see it so often where once they have an opportunity to work on a project based on something they're interested in, that just, you can visually see the motivation that comes with that when they get an idea and start working on it, ideally in collaboration with others. So just seen it time and time again. So it started with my brother, but then over the years in all our projects, just seeing when young people are encouraged and have a space for bringing in something they're interested in. It could be just a small idea or something that they're really passionate about, but then it just grows, like the motivation continues and builds on itself.
And I think that work also that led us to develop what we've come to call the guiding the 4 P's of creative learning.
Right.
They're sort of guiding principles, projects, passion, peers, and play. So interest was about passion. We saw that we want to engage young people, work on projects, but just work on projects is not enough. It had to be projects that they cared about, they were passionate about, in collaboration with peers to connect with others, in a playful spirit where they were experimenting and trying new things.
Yeah, so that really started in the clubhouse. And again, just seeing how young people would build on their interests and start making projects based on that. And then when we were developing Scratch, of course, we thought we really wanted to bring that whole idea. So we did a lot of different things when we were designing Scratch, from what kind of images are available, sounds, the types of example projects, the kind of prompts that would help people bring in something that was meaningful to them.
There was even a direct connection, I know, as our work at the clubhouses in the 1990s, where we saw lots of kids wanted to create their own games, wanted to create their own animations, but they didn't have the right tools for doing it. So that's what sparked the idea for Scratch, was really the interest of the kids at the clubhouse.
Right. So then we wanting to bring that whole approach of developing projects based on your interests and being able to collaborate. In this case, like in the clubhouses, is with the people around you. But then in Scratch, it was online, being able to share and learn from each other, which has been so powerful. Like when I heard there was, and when we talked about a way to share on Scratch, I didn't realize just how important, how powerful that aspect of community. And as we sometimes say, kids often come because they want to create projects to Scratch, but they stay for the community because of what they learn from others and seeing others with similar interests from yours, but also seeing, other people have another interest. That's interesting to me now too. So I think by sharing projects based on your interests, you also start to expand your interests and also build relationships and peers that you can, be friends with and collaborate with.
But I think one thing that I know it's made me so happy about Scratch, and I'm sure for you too, it's not just the number of projects the kids have created. They've created hundreds of millions of projects, since Scratch launched. But for me, it's the diversity of projects and the range of projects, because kids have different interests. They want to make different things. So I think Scratch succeeded because it allowed different kids to work on different sorts of things, all based on their interests.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable now that just how it's grown, and you can basically search for any kind of interest or idea or kind of, whether it's, in animation, music, science, math, art, combinations of those, and you'll find, or a particular kind of character, you'll find people who also have made projects that you can start to remix and connect with.
I think we see when you work on things you care about, not only does it make you more motivated, I also think it gives you a deeper connection to the ideas you engage with. I think you've heard me I often tell the story of one young Scratcher who was working on a game, and he was happy with his game, but he wanted to keep score, and he didn't know how it could keep score. So I showed him how we could use a variable, and he inserted the variable and suddenly was keeping score, and he was so excited, and he reached out his hand and said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And I thought, how many algebra teachers get thanked by students when they teach them variables? And it doesn't happen. And it just showed how at the clubhouse, since kids were learning about variables in a context they really cared about, they were more motivated. But I'm sure he was able to then continue to make use of it in other contexts because he really understood it.
People often think that, I think it's a typical idea of like, well, teach them variables and then they'll decide how they want to use it. And I think it's really the opposite idea, which is he wanted to keep score in a game, or they have an idea of something they want. And then he learned, there's this thing, that'll let you do that. It's called a variable. Then it's meaningful. So it starts first with the concrete project idea versus abstractly trying to teach about variables. If there's no connection, then they're not going to really pay attention to it. But once they know, this is how I keep score, I want to learn about this thing.
Yeah, I think too often people think, well, first you have to teach kids the basics, teach them the concepts, then they can make use of them. I think we've always tried to say, we agree that it's important for them to learn those things. They should learn it through projects, not before projects.
Yeah, much more motivating and meaningful to develop it in the context of a project.
I know sometimes as we've designed new technologies or new workshops or activities or courses, we've used this metaphor of low floor, high ceiling, wide walls. And Seymour Papert talked about the importance of designing for low floors, easy to get started with, high ceilings, so you can do more and more complex things over time. But I think a place where we've made a contribution is really focusing on the wide walls to make sure that there's not just one way to go from low floor to high ceiling, but for many different ways, because different kids will have different paths to get started and then to continue. So maybe thinking a little bit about designing for wide walls and some of the strategies that we've used for designing for wide walls, whether it's in Scratch or the new project that we've been working on the last couple of years, OctoStudio.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, there's all these different ways to signal or to encourage people to bring in their own interests and ideas. And I do think sometimes it's just, well, obviously the example you use not just giving one example, but often giving a couple. You don't want to overwhelm with examples either, but showing that there's a range, from like what kind of, illustration or just what kind of topic. So it could all be like, for example, when we do in OctoStudio, create a creature, that could be any kind of animal that the young person's interested in. It could be realistic or a fantasy. And so it just brings in a lot of, some kids are really into fiction, some nonfiction. They have different interests. So I think having a prompt and then also showing examples where they could see, oh, it could look like this. So one of the examples kind of sparks their imagination of like, oh, okay, so what do I want to do? Then also like in OctoStudio as well as Scratch, the example images show a wide range of different kinds of characters so that you can think which one appeals to me. Or also we always have tools to bring in your own, to record your own voice, to draw yourself, to take a picture. So that's where like Wide Walls, both having the tools to do it, but then also the examples, as well as the prompt or the kind of question that you ask. And often it's like, can be a small shift to take something that's very close, like everyone do the same thing, to something that's an invitation that allows young people to bring in what they're interested in and to build on that.
Yeah. And I know like with OctoStudio, it's been great to see the range of different things that kids have created, some that we never imagined.
Yeah.
Just all the different interests that they're building upon. Are there any that sort of jump out to you about things that you've seen about kids following their interests?
Well, it is, I'm trying to think, there's just so many, like the fact that the team has made it so that you can use the sensors that are built into your device, tablet or phone, that allows a lot of physical kind of bringing in. For example, Rupal colleague's daughter brought with her stuffed animal, bringing a voice to it without even using the screen, but just every time you shook the backpack that it was wearing, it would say something. So it allowed her favorite stuffed animal to come to life. But also you can do more sophisticated games as well. But then there's also storytelling, and that's been a really rich thing of bringing in your own examples of stories. What were you
But I like, was we talked about the shake sensor, that you can use the sensor. And so one way is when you sort of, shake your a stuffed animal will talk to you. But then I was also thinking about, there was the boy in Rwanda who wanted to make his own step tracker.
Right.
So he used the same sensor, but instead of having it talk, like he put it to his leg, and whenever he took a step, it could tell that he was moving. It counted his number of steps.
Yeah.
So again, those are such different types of projects. But if you have the right type of, give them the right tools, the kids can use it in so many different ways. I think that, if you had to give people some advice about, obviously we've tried to take advantage of this idea of, building on interests as we've designed new technologies, but it's like educators are putting this into practice, in their classrooms. What advice would you give them about how to help young people build on their interests, or how educators can build on their own interests as well?
Right. I think that is so important. I think I've told you when I was in junior high, there was this few-week period where teachers were allowed to teach something that they chose. And my teachers chose very different types of topics, like from different figures of speech in songs, like metaphors and similes. We could pick a song and look at that. One was interested in dreams. One was interested in, justice system. But so very diverse things, but it was really interesting because some of the teachers who were not that inspired to be teaching what they were normally teaching, suddenly you saw them come to life and be so motivated, and you learned another side of them. And I just think giving educators as well as young people these opportunities, and sometimes it could be like, there's like this idea of passion projects where young people can pick what they want. But I think also sometimes it's just shifting the question or prompt that you give. For example, some people have used Scratch to do food chain where you show how one thing eats another, through the system from plants to animals. And I think that is an opportunity for kids to bring in, like, are they interested in dinosaurs? Are they interested in underwater creatures? You could really make within one classroom, this prompt of like, show something on the food chain. It could be, you know, a person. But the way that it was shown to do it was to have every single student do the same project. Like every student show a rabbit eating grass and then a hawk taking away the, you know, grabbing the rabbit, eating it. Well, first of all, if I was a kid, I would be horrified with that. But also it just doesn't, then everyone's doing the same thing. It's not nearly as interesting as if you have a whole classroom or group of students all doing different ones or working in pairs and like, oh, what did you do? Oh, how did you do that? They're all engaging with the same process, but much more engaging because they're building on something that they're interested in, and you have a diversity of projects within a room that you can learn from.
I think that social side is important. Sometimes when we talk about building on interests, it can seem rather individual.
Right.
That I'm building on my interests. And,
right.
And sometimes we think like at a clubhouse, you have to have this child find their interest and have them do their particular thing.
Yeah.
But I think one thing I learned from you was sometimes our interests develop in connection with other people. If there's someone we admire and enjoy spending time with, we sort of can, that influences how we develop our interests.
Yeah.
So sort of those 4 Ps, projects, passion, peers, and play.
Yeah.
The passion and peers definitely can interact with each other.
And we saw recently in the local schools, too, the kids were sharing a device, a tablet, but they would each bring in the animal that they were interested in. And that made for really interesting projects. It was like, how did these 2 animals interact? So it's bringing together their interests. But I agree, just how you start to learn about and get to know someone by learning about what they're interested in, and you can start collaborating through that.
Maybe just to wrap up, we've talked about these 4 Ps as a way of helping young people develop the 4 Cs to become creative, curious, caring, and collaborative learners. As you think about as we try to work to get these ideas out to the world, what are some of the misconceptions people have, or what are some of the obstacles that are faced of helping? Because I think, you know, we see that these are so important for really to bring about meaningful change in the world, but it's not easy. There's a lot of ways in which it's been challenging. It's been easier to get the technology of Scratch out to hundreds of millions of kids than to get these educational ideas out. What do you see as some of the obstacles, and what can we do to help people understand better the use of projects, passion, peers, and play to help young people develop as creative, curious, collaborative, and caring learners?
I do think one barrier is feeling like this responsibility that like, okay, why did they say that every kid was going to do the same project? They didn't really trust that kids given a prompt would start to really engage in these ideas, these core ideas about food chain. By giving a broader prompt, there's less control immediately by the curriculum developer, the teacher, but there's much more motivation and momentum and sharing and life that comes from it. So I think it's having some trust, and part of that just from experience. And again, we've seen it time and time again by giving a prompt that a topic and some examples that encourage people to bring in their own ideas. I guess the other I just want to say is that sometimes people think, well, some kids have very strong interests, like music. As a kid, I wouldn't have been able to say what was my one thing. But I think, you know, as I've learned over time, part of it was that I was interested in learning, but that wasn't seen as an interest that kids have. But I think that by encouraging people to just have materials available, it doesn't have to be like a big P passion, but it could be a small idea, and just sparking ideas by examples and materials, and you'll see a change. I remember a kid about to make something, and he didn't have an idea. Other people in the room design a park. He didn't really have an idea of what he wanted to make. And then he was looking at the materials and the examples, and then suddenly you could just see the energy that came. And I asked what, and he had an idea to make a skateboarder in the park. And so then he was just motivated, really motivated. So how can we encourage, just like through what we have in the environment and the questions and the tools that we give, to really encourage and trust that young people, given that opportunity, will start to really get motivated and to create and share and collaborate.
And maybe with my love of alliteration, we'll end with one extra alliteration. It sounds that with all the things you're saying will help lead to more motivating, memorable, and meaningful experiences.
Yep.
So anyway, thanks so much for joining us on the
Thank
Lifelong
you.
Kindergarten podcast.
Thanks, everyone.
The Lifelong Kindergarten podcast is produced by Mitch Resnick and Eric Schelling in the Lifelong Kindergarten Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. You can find other episodes, additional resources, and online conversation in our Substack at bit.ly/LLK podcast.